Turkey is a long-standing member of NATO with the alliance's second-largest army, but its president is becoming an increasingly difficult partner, defaming Israel as fascist, praising Hamas as liberators. That posed a diplomatic challenge for Germany's chancellor as he prepared to receive the Turkish leader. Under Erdogan's rule, Turkey has flexed its muscles near and far, seeking to project power from the Caucasus to the Mediterranean, courting both Russia and China. The president's autocratic policies at home and his abrasive actions abroad are alienating partners who nonetheless depend on him. Is Turkey on a collision course with NATO? Today we're asking, between NATO and Hamas, what is Erdogan's aim? Welcome to the Point. It is a great pleasure to greet our guests, starting with Dilek Kurban. She is a visiting researcher at Berlin's Social Sciences Center, and she has also reported in the past for Turkish media. I'm also very pleased to welcome Thomas Avenarius. He's an international correspondent for Germany's Süddeutsche Zeitung. He has been based in the Middle East and reported also from Istanbul. And with us in Istanbul is Bülent Mumay. He is an independent correspondent for both Turkish and German media, also for Deutsche Welle, and he does join us from Istanbul. Welcome to you. Dilek, just before departing for a visit to Germany, President Erdogan stepped up his harsh rhetoric on the conflict in Gaza, declaring Israel to be, quote, a terror state and war criminal, and calling the crisis a matter of cross and crescent. That practically sounds like holy warfare. What's behind all this venom?
I mean, in a sense, he's being typical Erdogan. He has done this in the past. Not just when Israel is concerned, but he's speaking to domestic constituents. That's his main target, right? I mean, we have elections coming in Turkey, municipal elections next year. So he's trying to mobilize the base, consolidate it. In Turkey, public opinion is very pro-Palestinian and against Israel. There's always this anti-Israel sentiment that he wants to, sort of mobilize. And I think he's also counting on the fact that he will once again get away with it, because he's always gotten away with it in terms of his relations with the West. He doesn't expect any repercussions from NATO and from European allies.
And Bülent, tell us what you're hearing from people there. Are these statements by Erdogan resonating with his political base, but also with other Turkish citizens?
Well, actually, as we are divided into two nations, as we are a huge polarized country, Erdogan's sentences work for his audience, but for regular people who are against him, it doesn't work. As Dilek said, of course, it's a pro-Palestinian community in Turkey, but Erdogan's harsh words are not being accepted by the whole community in Turkey.
Thomas, this rhetoric, this bashing of Israel comes just about 6 weeks after the Turkish and Israeli leaders actually met on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and Erdogan held out the prospect of intensive cooperation between the two. And he clearly had some very concrete economic goals in mind. So what's with the abrupt switch?
Well, we all know that Erdogan is a very populistic leader, and the relation of Israel and Turkey have been disturbed before. So he's just riding the wave and switching positions. I don't know if he can get back so easily now, because he said Israel has no right of existence. But he's also not only concentrating on the Turkish population, he's also looking on the wider Muslim world. And we all know that the perspective of the wider Muslim world is different from the Western European or German or United States perspective towards Israel. So I think in the wider Muslim world, he's probably, making points at the moment.
Let's take a closer look at Erdogan's abrupt switch from courting Israel to bashing it and to promoting hate rather than the regional cooperation that he was seeking just 6 weeks ago.
Whenever Turkish President Erdogan has spoken about the Middle East recently, he verbally attacked Israel and the West. Israel, we will denounce you as a war criminal in front of the whole world. The main culprit behind the massacre unfolding in Gaza is the West. Hamas is not a terrorist organization, but a group of mujahideen defending their lands. Words that go down well with many in Turkey and cause outrage in the West. Erdogan makes no mention of the Israeli victims of the Hamas terror attacks. As someone connected to both the Palestinians and Israel, Erdogan initially offered to mediate. Erdogan personally met Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in September for the first time. But how serious was he about this new friendship? Experts have long warned that Turkey has been a safe haven for Hamas members. As recently as July, Erdogan received Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of the militant Islamist organization in Ankara. Pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas. What is the Turkish president's goal?
Let me go over to you, Bülent, and pick up on the final point that we heard in that report about Turkey being a safe haven for Hamas. In fact, it has been described as Hamas' second largest base of operations after Gaza. And Istanbul is a major, possibly the major source of financing for Hamas operations. So would you go so far as to say that without Turkey's support, Hamas would not have the capacity to launch operations of the kind that it did on October 7th?
Actually, that's not a fair comment, because Istanbul might be just, for them, it can just be a political base. We know that they are being supplied by Qatar and by Iran. So Turkey is not, in that case, Turkey is not that a big issue for Hamas. But we know that all their officials, most of their officials were in Istanbul and in Ankara until they attacked.
Let me ask whether either of our guests in the studio would disagree with that assessment.
I wouldn't disagree, I would agree. Istanbul is the main base of the Arab opposition all over the world. I mean, from all the Muslim countries, people are based in Istanbul because there's no place to be at home, because they can't move around. So I think if you want to know who financially supports Iran, you have to, Hamas, you have to look to Iran first and then to Qatar. Political support for sure. And Erdogan was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood movements all over the Arab world. Hamas is an offspring of the Muslim Brotherhood, so it's more or less logical that he supports Hamas and is doing it now in a very loud way.
Dilek, is there an ideological affinity between the AKP party, Erdogan's party in Turkey, and Hamas?
Yes, certainly. I mean, as Thomas said earlier, also, Erdogan sees himself as, he aspires to be the leader of the Muslim world. Of course, the Muslim world is also divided in terms of political power, but he certainly is on the side with Hamas. And I think it is important to see that, I mean, he's on the one hand, he pursues realpolitik with all this anti-Israeli rhetoric, for example. He doesn't sanction Israel. There are reports in Turkish media of shipments from Turkey continuing to go to Israel. You know, he's doing trade because, you know, he wants to. So that's realpolitik. But then we also have to see the ideological side of AKP and Erdogan. And that is, he definitely is it's political Islam and Islamism. And I think it's not just, I think we have to be careful not to characterize this just against the current Israeli government, but there is a deep sentiment also in Turkish society of anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, which I think he also personally shares. And he's playing, so he's playing a game of both. And as long as I said earlier, he can get away with it, he'll continue doing that.
Let me come back to the game of both with you, Thomas. Actually, shortly after the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel, Erdogan said in a telephone call with German Chancellor Scholz that he sees Turkey as being ready to mediate in this conflict. And clearly that's part of the aim that you talked about being a leader in the Islamic world in the region. Has he now, with his statements, thoroughly disqualified himself for any mediating role? Or are his ties to Hamas perhaps exactly what's needed?
Well, I tried to explain that Erdogan is the type that reacts to situations. So he offered to mediate in Afghanistan. He offered to mediate in Ukraine. He's not really successful, but he's always offering because it sounds good. I think he stepped the red line. You know, to come to Germany after you said Israel has no right of existence and is a fascist state, it will be quite difficult for him to get common ground with Scholz. But he's playing that game quite systematically.
And Bülent, if I can ask you, it was mentioned by Dilek just now, Israel is a very important economic partner for Turkey. Trade between the two is extensive and it's also expanding. Oil, weapons, and it is at that meeting in New York that I mentioned between Netanyahu and Erdogan in late September, Turkey also held out the prospect of much stronger cooperation on tech and on energy.
Well, there are two issues so important in Turkey nowadays. Now we have the elections on March, and we are suffering a huge economic crisis. Because of both issues, Erdogan cannot open a direct economical, financial war against Israel. As you know, aiding terrorism is a huge crime, even in Turkey. And if you are calling a country as a terror country, like Erdogan said for Israel, and now every day 10 ships are going from Turkey, carrying steel, carrying food, carrying petrol from Turkish coasts to Israel. So he is helping that he is calling Israel as a terrorist country. He's aiding terrorism right now, as he is alleged. So he's just faking and using it for interior politics to be able to use that anti-Semitist his speech. That's all. It's not just, he can't cut the ties. Even when a Turkish ferry has been stopped 10 years ago, has been stopped by Israeli forces, and 10 Turkish citizens have been killed, the same Erdogan's son was sending with his own ships petroleum to Israel. So it's just a game.
A double game. Dilek, explain something else that appears, at least to outside eyes, to be a contradiction. Erdogan condemns the bombing of Gaza by Israel, yet he regularly orders warplanes to bomb Kurdish territories in northern Syria, including areas near the U.S. troops that are battling ISIS. How does he rationalize that?
He doesn't have to, because he's not asked these questions. Certainly not in Turkey, because he has almost total control over the media, but also not by the West. And I think that's one of the main fundamental problems here. We don't see coverage in the media, also internationally, of what he's doing in northern Syria, which is under Turkish occupation. So it's occupying actually another country against international law, and of course using, as you said, bombing it. It is, and that, if you would ask him, he would characterize that as counterterrorism, because he considers the PYD, which represents the armed Kurdish groups in Syria, as a terrorist organization, which is not shared by the West and the US, not by the EU too. From his worldview, it makes total sense, because it's all terrorism. The Kurds are terrorists, and Israel is also, right? That's how he characterizes it. These kind of questions about, because he doesn't have to explain any contradiction, he just says it and does it. It is the West that really needs to hold him accountable to all of these, his violations of international law, but also his violations of European and NATO norms.
So let's talk about the West in the form of NATO. Thomas, in fact, Erdogan is the only NATO leader who has expressed open support of Hamas. That has been widely reported, and questions have been asked, yet NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg played it down this week, saying, I quote, the terrorist support for the terrorist group on the part of Erdogan poses no problem for NATO because the alliance plays no role in the Israeli-Hamas conflict. Really?
Well, I mean, what shall Stoltenberg say, Melinda? Turkey is the second biggest army in NATO. It's a very well equipped and very forceful army. So Erdogan plays the game with NATO for quite a long time. He's blocking Sweden's membership in NATO. Erdogan is just fooling NATO, and NATO cannot afford to kick him out. NATO just needs him. NATO just needs Turkey. It borders Russia, it borders the Caucasus, it borders Ukraine. So what shall NATO do? So Stoltenberg is trying to avoid the problem.
Bülent, it sounds like Thomas is telling us that Turkey has NATO over a barrel.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
It sounds like Thomas is saying to us that Turkey has NATO essentially over a barrel, that NATO is so dependent on Turkey that it cannot call out actions that clearly conflict with the alliance's principles.
Absolutely. And as we know that Erdogan uses every crisis to create much more power for himself. Like in Ukraine, he tried to be the mediator just to gain much more power. By using the refugee issue, he tried to use it as a leverage. Now he's trying to use the same crisis between Hamas and between Israel. He tried to be the mediator. But please don't forget that after the first attacks of Hamas or after the first attacks of Israel, Erdogan was so quiet for 2 weeks. He tried to be the mediator. When that aim wasn't accepted, then he started to harshly criticize Israel. So he always wants to gain much more power from that crisis. Now he's trying to do the same thing in NATO, trying to block something to gain much more things for himself.
Mm-hmm. In fact, Dilek, he did blame Sweden joining NATO for nearly 18 months after most of the rest of the allies had agreed that Sweden and Finland absolutely should join. He now has presented the accession agreement to the Turkish parliament. So he seems to have climbed down on that one. Nonetheless, clearly Turkey is a necessary NATO partner, but is it a reliable one?
It certainly is not, but I think it is, and I wouldn't maybe share what Thomas said earlier, that NATO is, of course it is dependent on Turkey, but this kind of feeling of, on the part of the EU, NATO and European governments that they need Turkey only emboldens Erdogan further. And I mean, these appeasement, there's a whole history of appeasement policies on the part of Europe and the US, but especially Europe, towards Erdogan. Bülent mentioned the refugee deal earlier, there is NATO question. And every time when the West shows weakness and fear, that just emboldens him even further. I think here the balance is, it's clearly the West that's more powerful than Erdogan. Turkey is very much dependent on the West, militarily, economically, financially, etc. I think it's really time for example, tomorrow Olaf Scholz to publicly show, sort of strength and signal to Erdogan and to Turkey that, the West will not keep tolerating this kind of unreliable behavior on the part of a NATO member.
Clearly, Erdogan prepares for his visit to Germany with a vision of himself as a strong leader of a 100-year-old republic with a golden future. But in fact, at home, skyrocketing inflation, a plunging currency, and unorthodox economic policies are provoking doubt, especially among the young.
Istanbul, 6 months into President Erdogan's third term in office. More and more people want to leave Turkey, especially those that are young and educated. One of them is Hüseyin Büyükdağ, an English teacher.
In Germany or in any Western country, you are a valuable person. And in Turkey, you're not a valuable person because you can be a traitor in any time.
People are in despair over the repression in Erdogan's authoritarian system, but also over the economic crisis and the high cost of living. Most recently, the official inflation rate was at 61%. But it is difficult to get a visa. Some pay smugglers and make their way to Western Europe via the Balkan route. In Germany, almost a third of all asylum seekers now come from Turkey. In October alone, there were almost 10,000, the second largest group after Syrian refugees. Hüseyin Büyükdağ also wants to go to Germany. Is the elite losing faith in Erdogan's promise of a Turkish century?
And we'll come back to that question in just a moment. But Thomas, let me ask you, first of all, about this. Chancellor Scholz is going to receive Erdogan, despite quite a bit of pushback from a number of groups in Germany who say he should not be doing so. One of the reasons is that Germany and the EU are looking to Turkey to help stem migration into the EU. On the other hand, we've just heard that Turkey is actually, or Erdogan's policies are actually triggering migration to this country. Why is Chancellor Scholz receiving Erdogan at this moment?
Well, I mean, the EU needs him because of the refugees, even if the mechanism is not working as EU has expected it to work. It just doesn't work this way, and Erdogan is playing this game with it. And the second thing is, would you refuse to receive Erdogan in Germany? What does it really mean? It's quite difficult. Put pressure on Erdogan on the Palestinian issue, on the Israel issue, is very, very difficult. It is not so easy. And I do not agree with you that the West, let's not talk about the West because the West doesn't exist, but to put pressure on Erdogan, that's not that easy. There's even a mechanism to exclude someone from NATO. I mean, what do you want to do? And he's playing the Russia game. So I think he's in a very, very strong position, and he will show that strong position when he comes to Berlin, and he will accuse Scholz that Kurdish demonstrations are showing that terrorists can move around in Germany without any police control, and he will confront that with the Hamas terrorism issue.
Dilek, the last time that you sat at this table, it was just a few days before the election in Turkey, where you and the others had a sense that possibly the opposition might topple him from power. When you now look at the outlook for your country, you see a report like that and describing the economic misery you know so well. What is your sense of where Turkey is going and how the West can maintain relations with this country?
I mean, it's downfall from here. It's just getting worse and worse. The elections were indeed a chance for things to start to change for the better, but it didn't work. I mean, we now have a crisis, for example, between the high courts in Turkey, where a high court of appeals openly made a criminal complaint against members of the Turkish Constitutional Court for a judgment that they've delivered that upset Erdogan. So he is going to consolidate his one-man rule more and more, his complete control of the judiciary, the media, economy. So the only thing is, I mean, the economy is not doing well. So that's one question. If there is a serious economic crisis, that might perhaps bring his end, but later, I mean, he's just so strong. And the other is, of course, the West. I mean, there are still things that can be done. EU accession, for example. I mean, there's no reason why Turkey still has that accession status, although, of course, clearly violates Copenhagen political criteria. I mean, that's something to do, to use, sanctions, etc. I mean, there's just things to be done on the part of the West and EU and NATO. But I don't see that happening too because of this feeling that they're dependent on Turkey, the migration, etc. So I'm afraid Turkey is going to go, a situation is going to go, continue going really badly until, I do not know, maybe an big economic crisis. As long as he's alive and mighty, I just do not see in the short term how this is going to change.
Bülent, if I come back to our title, as you remember, it is Between NATO and Hamas. What is Erdogan's aim? And from everything that all of you have said, it's clear that his aim is to maintain and expand his own power. If that is the case, should Germany essentially be receiving and supporting him at this critical moment when Germany itself is striving to show solidarity with Israel and fight anti-Semitism here at home, the same anti-Semitism he is provoking with his statements?
Cutting ties is never a solution. Of course, Mr. Scholz can accept Mr. Erdogan, and they can be in contact. But the thing is, yes, West, let's say Germany needs Turkey, or West needs Turkey. But at the same time, Erdogan needs Western support too much, especially in financial means. Like, if you just support him and if you just make him feel that he's just a strong guy, he will take and ask for more. That's Erdogan's way, as we all know. But at the same time, West actually should always remind him that he has to be connected with the democratic rules. I'm sure you know, Melinda, Even Deutsche Welle has been banned in Turkey. People cannot access on our website without using VPN. Every day another journalist is being arrested. I have been sentenced to 20 months a couple of months ago. So things are getting worse here. And West, when they are having conversation with Mr. Erdogan, they should remind him and use their power, which they have among him.
Let me go quickly to Thomas. Cutting ties is not an answer, says Bülent. You would agree?
Yes, I would fully agree.
Dilek?
Well, it depends which ties. I think some ties needs to be cut. EU accession process, status, for example, should be lifted. Turkey should be suspended from the Council of Europe. I think certain ties needs to be broken.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Do check out our YouTube channel and let us know what you think. See you soon. Months you've been sentenced to.